Some men choose solitude because the world has taken too much from them. Caleb Stone had been that man for 15 years, living alone in the Wyoming mountains where no one could reach him. One frozen morning in 1882, he hears a woman's cry from the river below. He pulls her from the icy water and carries her to his cabin. Her name is Emma Clark. She's running from something just like him. The blizzard traps them together. She looks at him with grateful eyes and says, "You saved me, I'll save you from loneliness." He doesn't believe her. He's forgotten how to let anyone in. But can two people who've lost everything find something worth living for in each other? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin sat in a clearing carved from pine and spruce, backed against a granite cliff that blocked the worst of the north wind. Smoke rose from the stone chimney in a steady gray column, the only sign of life for 20 miles in any direction. Inside, Caleb Stone moved through his morning routine with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd done the same things in the same order for more years than he cared to count. He was 42 years old, though the mountains had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with time. His hair, once dark brown, had gone mostly gray at the temples. His face carried the weathered lines of a man who'd spent decades squinting into wind and sun. His hands were scarred and calloused, strong enough to split wood all day without tiring. He stood just over 6 feet tall, broad across the shoulders, lean everywhere else. There was nothing soft about Caleb Stone. Not anymore. The cabin reflected its owner. One room, maybe 20 feet square, with a sleeping loft above reached by a crude ladder. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth blackened by 15 winters of constant use. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, though he'd only ever needed one, occupied the center of the space. Shelves lined the walls, holding supplies: dried beans, cornmeal, coffee, salt, ammunition. Traps and snowshoes hung from pegs. A rifle rested above the door. Everything had its place. Everything served a purpose. Caleb stood at the table now, sharpening his hunting knife with slow, methodical strokes against a wet stone. The blade was old, older than his exile. The handle was worn smooth from years of use, and if you looked closely, you could see initials carved into the dark wood: CS plus MR. He never looked closely anymore. The knife had been with him since his days as a lawman, back when he'd been Sheriff Stone of Blackwood, Montana Territory. Back when he'd worn a badge and believed in justice and thought he could protect the people he loved. The knife had served him well in that life. It served him differently now. Skinning game, cutting rope, whittling by firelight on the endless winter nights. It was a tool, nothing more. He'd learned not to think about what those initials meant, about the woman who'd laughed when he carved them there on a summer evening that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. Outside, the wind howled. February in the Wyoming high country was unforgiving. The snow lay 4 feet deep in places, 6 feet in the drifts. The sky had been gray for a week straight, and the cold bit through even the thickest furs. Caleb was used to it. He'd chosen this place precisely because it kept the world away. No one came up here. No one could. He set the knife aside and walked to the window, such as it was, a small opening covered with oiled hide that let in dim light, but kept out the worst of the cold. Through it, he could see the frozen creek that ran past his clearing, and beyond it, the dark wall of pines that climbed up toward the ridgeline. Somewhere down there, maybe 5 miles as the crow flew, the creek joined a larger river. He rarely went that far. There was no need. He turned back to the room, and that's when he saw her. Really saw her, for the first time since he'd pulled her from the river 3 days ago. She lay in his bed, the only bed, covered in every blanket and fur he owned. Her face was pale against the dark wolf pelts, but the deathly gray color had faded. Her breathing was steady now, Not the shallow, rattling gasps that had terrified him that first night. He'd done what he could, stripped off her frozen clothes, wrapped her in dry blankets, forced warm broth between her lips when she was barely conscious. He'd tended fevers before, back in his old life. He'd prayed, though he'd stopped believing his prayers did any good years ago. She was younger than him, maybe 30. Dark hair, long and tangled now, spread across his pillow. Even unconscious, even after nearly dying, there was something strong in her face. Not beautiful exactly, though she might have been once. Hardship had touched her, left its mark in the fine lines around her eyes and mouth. She'd known trouble. He recognized it because he carried the same marks himself. Caleb moved closer, checking her forehead with the back of his hand. No fever. That was good. The frostbite on her fingers and toes hadn't turned black. She'd keep them all, probably. He'd done everything right, kept her alive when she should have died in that river. Now what was he supposed to do with her? He hadn't spoken to another human being in more than a year. Before that, maybe once or twice a year, he'd trade furs at Fort Bridger, 60 miles south. He'd grunt responses to questions, take his supplies, leave before anyone could engage him in conversation. He'd built this life deliberately, stone by stone, mile by mile. Alone was safe. Alone meant you couldn't fail anyone, couldn't lose anyone, couldn't stand by helpless while the people you loved. He cut off the thought, automatic as breathing after all these years. Don't go there. Don't. Remember. Work. Stay busy. Survive. But now there was a woman in his bed, breathing his air, disrupting the careful balance he'd maintained for 15 years. He felt something crack inside him, something he'd thought was frozen solid. It felt like fear. Water. Her voice was barely a whisper, rough from disuse. Caleb turned sharply. Her eyes were open, dark brown, looking directly at him. Confused, but conscious. Alert. He grabbed the tin cup from the table, dipped it in the water bucket, and brought it to her. She tried to sit up, winced, fell back. He slid his arm behind her shoulders, supporting her weight, and held the cup to her lips. She drank greedily, water spilling down her chin. He pulled it back. Slow, he said. His own voice sounded strange to him, rusty. You'll make yourself sick. She looked at him, really looked at him, and something shifted in her expression. Not fear, exactly. Assessment. She was taking his measure, this rough mountain man in his cabin in the middle of nowhere. You saved my life, she said. Found you in the river. Couldn't just leave you. How long have I been here? 3 days. She closed her eyes, and he saw tears leak from the corners. 3 days, she repeated. Oh God, 3 days. There was something in her voice, some desperate urgency that made Caleb uncomfortable. He eased her back down onto the blankets and stepped away, putting distance between them. You need rest, he said. You nearly died. Another hour in that water and... I have to go. She tried to sit up again, and this time she made it, though her whole body shook with the effort. I have to get to Fort Bridger. I have to... You're not going anywhere. Caleb's voice was firm. There's a blizzard outside. Even if you were healthy, which you're not, you wouldn't make it a mile. The snow's over your head in places. You don't understand. Her voice broke. I have to get there. I have to get to my son. The words hung in the air between them. Son. She had a child somewhere. Caleb felt that crack inside him widen. Where is he? He asked, against his better judgment. Fort Bridger, with my husband's brother. He took him from me, said I wasn't fit, said I couldn't care for him properly. But I can. I will. I just need to get there. I need to show the territorial judge that I'm capable, that I have work, that I can... She was crying now, shaking not just from weakness, but from the force of her emotion. Caleb stood frozen, watching her fall apart in his bed, in his cabin, in the life he'd built specifically to avoid moments like this. Please, she said, looking up at him with those dark eyes full of desperate hope. Please, you saved my life. Help me save his." Caleb turned away, walked to the window, stared out at the white world beyond. The snow was still falling, the wind still howled. It would be weeks before the weather broke enough to travel, maybe longer. Behind him, he heard her crying, trying to muffle the sound in his blankets. He thought about the knife on the table, those carved initials he never looked at. He thought about a different woman, a different life, a different version of himself who'd believed he could protect the people who depended on him. He thought about failure and grief and the 15 years he'd spent running from both. "What's your name?" he asked, not turning around. "Emma," she said. "Emma Clark. I'm Caleb Stone. You can stay here until the weather breaks. Then we'll see about getting you to Fort Bridger." It wasn't a promise. It wasn't even a plan. It was just words, something to say to make her stop crying. But even as he said them, Caleb felt something shift in his carefully ordered world, felt the ice around his frozen heart begin, just barely, to crack. Outside, the blizzard raged on, burying the mountains deeper under snow, cutting them off from the world below. Inside the cabin, two broken people sat in silence, each carrying wounds they couldn't speak of, each running from pasts they couldn't escape. The knife lay on the table between them, its carved initials a reminder that some things, once marked, could never be unmade. Emma slept for another full day, her body demanding what it needed to heal. Caleb went about his routines, but everything felt different now. The cabin seemed smaller with another person in it. The silence felt heavier, weighted with unspoken things. He found himself listening for her breathing, checking on her more often than was necessary. It made him angry at himself, this concern for a stranger. On the 5th day, she was strong enough to sit at the table. Caleb had made venison stew, the same thing he'd been eating all winter, and she ate it like it was the finest meal she'd ever tasted. Color had returned to her cheeks. Her hands, bandaged where the frostbite had been worst, could hold a spoon. She was going to be fine, physically at least. "Tell me what happened," Caleb said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them through the meal. "How did you end up in that river?" Emma set down her spoon, her expression guarded. "I was traveling to Fort Bridger, alone. I hired a man with a wagon to take me over the mountain pass. The weather turned bad quickly. We tried to make it through anyway." She paused, staring down at her bowl. "The wagon went off the trail. I remember falling, hitting the ice, going under. The cold was—" She shuddered. "I don't remember anything else until I woke up here." "The man with the wagon?" "I don't know. I didn't see him after we went over." Caleb nodded slowly. Something about her story felt incomplete, but he didn't push. People kept their secrets for good reason. He knew that better than most. "This son of yours," he said. "Tell me about him." Emma's whole face changed. Despite everything she'd been through, despite the exhaustion and pain still visible in her eyes, she smiled. "Daniel. He's 8 years old. Smart as a whip, curious about everything. He has his father's eyes, but my stubbornness." The smile faded. "His father, my husband, died 2 years ago. Logging accident up in Montana. After that, everything fell apart." She stood, moving carefully, and walked to the corner where Caleb had piled her belongings. There wasn't much. A small canvas bag, her ruined dress and coat, a pair of boots. She dug through the bag and pulled out something small, something that caught the firelight. She brought it back to the table and set it down in front of Caleb. A locket. Silver, tarnished with age and wear, hanging from a delicate chain. Emma opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a photograph, the kind made by the traveling photographers who came through the frontier towns. A boy's face looked back at Caleb, serious, unsmiling in the way children had to be to hold still for the long exposure. He had his mother's dark eyes. Daniel, Emma said softly. This was taken last year, right before... Her voice broke. She closed her eyes, took a breath, continued. My husband's brother, Thomas, came to our house a month after the funeral. He said I couldn't manage on my own. Said a woman alone couldn't provide for a child. He had papers, legal documents. He took Daniel and I couldn't stop him. Caleb felt his jaw tighten. He knew men like that, had dealt with them in his years as a lawman. Men who hid behind the law while doing things that had nothing to do with justice. The territorial court gave him custody. Caleb asked. Temporary custody, until I could prove I was capable. But Thomas made sure I couldn't prove anything. Every job I tried to get, he interfered. Every place I tried to stay, he followed. He wanted me to disappear, to give up, to let him have Daniel permanently. Why? Emma looked at him. And there was something hard in her eyes now, something that reminded Caleb of himself. My husband owned land. Good land, with timber rights and water access. Valuable. The deed was in his name, but it passes to Daniel when he comes of age. Unless Daniel is deemed unfit or orphaned, then it goes to the next male relative. Thomas. So he takes your son and gets the land. Yes, but I won't let him. I've been working at a boarding house in Helena, saving every penny. I finally had enough to hire a lawyer in Fort Bridger. Someone who could help me petition the court again. I was supposed to meet him there. I was so close. Her voice cracked. And then the weather, and the wagon, and now 3 more days lost. Maybe he's given up on me. Maybe Thomas has already. Stop. Caleb's voice was quiet, but firm. Worrying about what might have happened won't help. What matters is what happens next. Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. What happens next is I get to Fort Bridger, as soon as possible, however possible. Caleb stood and walked to the window. The blizzard had finally broken that morning, but the snow lay deep everywhere. Travel would be difficult, dangerous even for someone who knew these mountains, for a woman still recovering from near death. It's 60 miles to Fort Bridger, he said, not turning around. Through country that's buried under 6 feet of snow right now. You're in no condition to make that journey. Then I'll go when I am. By the time you're strong enough and the snow has melted enough to travel, it'll be April, maybe May. He heard her stand, heard her cross the room to stand behind him. When she spoke, her voice was steady, determined. Then I'll leave tomorrow. Caleb turned to face her. She was standing close, too close, looking up at him with those dark eyes full of desperate resolve. She barely came up to his shoulder. Her hands were still bandaged. She could barely walk across the room without trembling from exhaustion. She wouldn't make it 5 miles. You'll die, he said flatly. Then I'll die trying to reach my son. She held up the locket, the chain swinging between them. This is all I have left of him. This and the promise I made when Thomas took him. I told Daniel I would come for him. I told him I would never stop trying. Do you have children, Mr. Stone? The question hit him like a fist to the gut. For a moment he couldn't breathe. He turned away from her, from those knowing eyes. No, he said finally. But you did once. Or you wanted to. I can see it. I can see the grief in you. You don't know anything about me. I know you live alone in the middle of nowhere for a reason. I know you have a woman's initials carved on that knife of yours, but there's no woman here. I know you pulled a stranger from a frozen river when you could have just walked away. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are, even if you've forgotten. Caleb felt anger rising in him, hot and familiar. This woman, this stranger, had no right to dig into his past, to say these things, to look at him like she could see straight through to the parts of himself he'd buried deep. You saved my life, Emma continued, softer now. You did that for a reason, whether you want to admit it or not. So I'm asking you now, help me finish what you started. Help me get to my son. I can't. The words came out harsh, harder than he intended. I told you that you could stay until the weather breaks, That's all I can do." Emma nodded slowly, and something shuddered in her expression. She slipped the locket back around her neck, tucking it beneath the shirt she'd borrowed from his extra clothes. When she looked at him again, her face was composed, resolved. "Thank you for saving my life, Mr. Stone. Thank you for your hospitality, but with or without your help, I'm leaving for Fort Bridger as soon as I'm able. I made a promise to my son, and I keep my promises." She walked back to the bed, moving carefully, and lay down with her back to him. The conversation was over. Caleb stood at the window as darkness fell outside. The temperature was already dropping. It would be well below zero by midnight. He thought about what she'd said, about promises and children and the things that drive people to desperate acts. He thought about his own promises, the ones he'd failed to keep, the ones that haunted him still in the deep hours of the night. He thought about the woman asleep in his bed, wearing his clothes, preparing to walk to her death for the sake of a child who needed her. And he thought about the initials on his knife, about Margaret and the baby they'd lost, about the life he'd failed to protect 15 years ago, about the fact that he'd been running ever since, telling himself it was better this way, safer to be alone where he couldn't fail anyone else. Emma had called him out on it. She'd seen right through him in a handful of days, and despite his anger, despite his fear, part of him, the part he'd thought was dead, whispered that she was right. He looked at the locket she'd shown him, could see it in his mind's eye. A boy's serious face, a mother's desperate love, a promise that mattered more than safety, more than fear, more than the very reasonable desire to stay alive. Outside, the stars emerged in a clear black sky. The storm had passed. By morning, Emma would be strong enough to try to leave, no matter what he said, and she would die in these mountains, frozen and alone, just like she'd nearly died in that river. Unless he did something about it. Caleb closed his eyes and felt the weight of decision settling on him like snow on a laden branch. He'd built this life to avoid exactly this kind of choice. But life, he was learning, had a way of finding you no matter how far you ran. The third week brought more than better weather. It brought change that neither of them had anticipated. Caleb was in the lean-to he'd built against the cabin's north wall, sorting through gear he hadn't touched in years. If they were going to make the journey to Fort Bridger, he'd need more than just his hunting rifle and knife. He'd need the tools of his old life, the life he'd walked away from 15 years ago. The wooden box was where he'd left it, buried under furs and traps and things he'd accumulated in his isolation. He brushed off the dust and opened it slowly, as if whatever was inside might bite him. In a way it would. The star badge lay on top, tarnished with age but still recognizable. Sheriff, Blackwood, Montana Territory. Beneath it, his old gun belt and revolver. A handful of wanted posters, yellowed and brittle. A leather-bound journal where he'd once kept notes on criminals and cases. And at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, a photograph. He didn't look at the photograph. He never did. He knew what it showed, himself and Margaret, taken the day they'd announced their engagement. They'd looked so young, so certain that the future held nothing but happiness. The photographer had told them not to smile. Exposures took too long, but you could see it in their eyes anyway. Joy, hope, love. Caleb rewrapped the photograph and put it back in the box, but he took out the badge, holding it in his palm. The metal was cold and heavy. It represented everything he'd been, everything he'd tried to become, and everything he'd failed at. But it also represented duty, justice, the belief that one person could make a difference in a world that often seemed bent on proving otherwise. "You kept it." He turned. Emma stood in the doorway of the lean-to, watching him. She'd gotten good at moving quietly. They both had, adjusting to the small space, learning each other's rhythms and boundaries. "I kept a lot of things I should have thrown away," Caleb said. Emma stepped inside, her breath misting in the cold air. She looked at the badge in his hand. "May I?" He handed it to her. She studied it, running her thumb over the engraved words. "Sheriff Stone," she read. "That was you. A lifetime ago." "Not so long." She looked up at him. "What made you think of getting this out now? If we're going up against your brother-in-law and his legal maneuvering, I thought it might help to remind people I wasn't always just a mountain hermit. A former lawman vouching for you might carry some weight with the territorial judge. You'd do that? Use your past to help me. That's why I got it out." Emma held the badge a moment longer, then gave it back to him. "Tell me something. Why did you really leave? It wasn't just grief, was it? There's something else." Caleb pinned the badge to his shirt. It fit like it had never been gone. "I told you, the gang that killed Margaret was never caught. I spent 2 years hunting them, and all I did was watch them slip through my fingers over and over. I couldn't protect her, couldn't bring her killers to justice, couldn't do the one thing a lawman is supposed to do. You couldn't save everyone. No one can. But I was supposed to save her." The words came out harder than he intended. "That was my job. As sheriff, as the man who loved her. I was supposed to keep her safe. Instead, she burned to death while I stood outside, held back by men who said it was too dangerous, that the building was already lost." He looked at Emma, needing her to understand. "I was a coward. I should have gone in anyway. Should have died trying. Instead, I let them hold me back, and I've been living with that choice ever since. That's not cowardice. That's survival. Is there a difference?" Emma stepped closer, and Caleb could see his own reflection in her dark eyes. Yes, a coward would have gone back to that same town, worn that same badge, and pretended nothing had changed. You left because you knew you'd become something you didn't want to be. That takes courage. Or it's just running away. Sometimes running away is the bravest thing you can do. Emma touched the badge on his shirt. But coming back, facing the things you've been running from, that's braver still. They stood, close in the small space of the lean-to, their breath mingling in the cold air. Caleb was acutely aware of her hand on his chest, of the way she was looking at him like she could see straight through to his bones, like she knew him better than he knew himself. "I'm not coming back," he said quietly. "I'm just helping you. After that, I'm going back to my mountain." "Are you sure about that?" "Yes." But even as he said it, Caleb felt the lie of it. Something had shifted in these weeks. The isolation he'd built so carefully, the walls he'd erected around his heart. Emma had slipped through them like water through stone, patient and persistent, and impossible to keep out. Emma seemed to read his thoughts. She smiled, sad and knowing. "You're a good man, Caleb Stone. I think you've forgotten that, but I haven't." She turned and left the lean-to, and Caleb stood alone with his badge and his old gun, and all the ghosts of his former life. He strapped on the gun belt. It fit perfectly, muscle memory guiding his hands through the familiar motions. He checked the revolver, loaded it, holstered it. The weight on his hip felt right in a way nothing had felt right in years. That evening, he taught Emma to shoot properly. They set up targets against the tree line, old pieces of wood marked with charcoal. He showed her how to stand, how to aim, how to breathe and squeeze rather than pull the trigger. She was a natural, or maybe just determined. Her shots grouped tight, even from a distance. "Your father taught you well," Caleb said, impressed despite himself. "My father taught me survival. You're teaching me something else." "What's that?" "How to fight back." As the sun set, painting the snow pink and gold, they stood side by side shooting at targets, and Caleb realized, with a mix of fear and something that might have been joy, that he was teaching her more than how to shoot. He was teaching her that she didn't have to face her battles alone, that sometimes strength came from knowing when to ask for help. And she was teaching him something too, that running from grief didn't heal it, that isolation wasn't safety, that maybe, just maybe, he deserved a second chance at something like happiness. That night, sitting by the fire after supper, Emma finally asked the question Caleb had been expecting. "The gang that killed Margaret," she said. "The leader you never caught. You said his name was Thomas Garrett." "Yes." Emma reached for the locket around her neck, opened it, stared at her son's photograph. "My brother-in-law's name is Thomas Clark, but before he came to Montana, before he married into respectability and land rights, he went by a different name." She looked up at Caleb, her face pale. "My husband mentioned it once, when he was drunk. Said his brother had a colorful past, a name he'd left behind." Caleb felt ice settle in his gut. "What name?" "Garrett. Thomas Garrett." The world seemed to stop. The fire crackled. The wind whispered outside. And Caleb stared at Emma, understanding dawning like a terrible sunrise. The man who had killed Margaret. The man he'd spent 2 years hunting. The man who'd gotten away. That man had Emma's son. The revelation hung between them like smoke from a gunshot. Caleb stood frozen, the name echoing in his mind. Thomas Garrett, the ghost he'd chased for 2 years, the man responsible for Margaret's death. That man had become respectable, taken a new name, married into a Montana family. And now he had Emma's son. "Are you certain?" Caleb's voice was steady, but Emma could hear the rage beneath it, controlled but barely. "James talked about it when he was drunk, said his older brother had wild years before settling down, that Thomas had been part of some gang down in the territories, got out before things went bad, changed his name, came to Montana looking for a fresh start." Emma's hands trembled as she closed the locket. James thought it was funny. Proof that even outlaws could become respectable if they played their cards right. Caleb walked to the window, stared out at the darkness. His mind was racing, fitting pieces together. Thomas Garrett disappears from the territories in 1867. Thomas Clark appears in Montana around the same time, marries into a family with land and connections, waits, plans. And when his younger brother dies, he sees an opportunity. Take the boy, take the land, eliminate any obstacles, including Emma. "The wagon accident," Caleb said, turning back to her. "It wasn't an accident." Emma had gone pale. "What do you mean?" "Think about it. You're traveling to Fort Bridger to meet a lawyer who can help you. Thomas knows this. He has to. He's been watching you, interfering with your work, making sure you stay powerless. Then suddenly you're on the move, and if you reach that lawyer, if you present your case to the judge, you might actually win. So what does he do? He makes sure I never get there." Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "The man with the wagon. Thomas could have paid him. Could have told him to make it look like an accident. Weather was bad anyway. Easy to claim the wagon slipped on ice. You go into the river, you die, and Thomas is the grieving uncle with full custody of a valuable piece of property. But I survived. You pulled me out. Yes, which means Thomas thinks you're dead. For now." Caleb came back to the table, sat down across from her. "Emma, this changes everything. We're not just going to Fort Bridger to argue your case in court. We're going to confront a man who's tried to kill you once already. A man who won't hesitate to do it again." Emma met his eyes, and he saw not fear but determination. "Then we'd better make sure we get to him before he knows I'm alive. This isn't a game. Thomas Garrett, Clark, whatever name he's using, he's dangerous. He was dangerous 15 years ago, and men like that don't get less dangerous with age. They just get more. Careful. He has my son, Caleb. I don't care how dangerous he is. I'm going to get Daniel back." Caleb saw himself in her, the same stubborn determination that had driven him to hunt Garrett for 2 years, the same willingness to risk everything for someone you loved. But he also saw the difference. Emma's love was for a living child who needed her. His had been for a dead woman and vengeance that would never bring her back. "Then we do this right," he said. "We plan. We prepare. We don't rush in blind." Over the next few days, they made ready. Caleb went through his old journal, reading the notes he'd made about Thomas Garrett and his gang 15 years ago. The man was smart, cautious, always 3 steps ahead. He used other people to do his dirty work, never took unnecessary risks, and he was absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting his interests. Emma shared everything she knew about Thomas Clark, his house in Fort Bridger, his business interests, a trading post, some mining claims, his reputation as a respectable member of the community, the way he had manipulated the courts to get custody of Daniel, using his dead brother's name and his own carefully constructed image. "He keeps Daniel at the house," Emma said. "Has a woman who cooks and cleans, supposedly to care for the boy, but Daniel isn't allowed to leave. Thomas says it's for his safety, but it's to control him," Caleb finished. "Keep him isolated, dependent. Make sure he doesn't tell anyone anything that might complicate Thomas's claim." They packed supplies for the journey. Caleb selected weapons: his rifle, his revolver, a spare pistol for Emma. Ammunition, his badge. The wanted poster he'd kept all these years, yellowed but still legible, showing Thomas Garrett's face and crimes. One evening, as they worked side by side preparing for departure, Emma found something in the bottom of Caleb's trunk, a small wooden box, delicate and carefully crafted. She opened it before thinking, and music filled the cabin, a lullaby, sweet and sad, played by a mechanism inside. Caleb looked up from cleaning his rifle, saw what she held, and went very still. "I'm sorry," Emma said quickly. "I shouldn't have." "It's all right." Caleb set down the rifle and came to her. "That was Margaret's. I gave it to her when she told me about the baby. She loved music boxes. Said they reminded her of her childhood." The lullaby played on, filling the space between them. Emma closed the box carefully, but Caleb reached out and opened it again. "Let it play," he said. They stood together, listening to the simple melody. And for the first time since Margaret's death, Caleb felt something other than pain when he thought of her. He felt gratitude for the time they had had, sorrow for the time they'd lost, but not the crushing, suffocating grief that had driven him into these mountains. "She had good taste," Emma said softly. She did. The music box wound down, the notes slowing until they stopped. In the silence that followed, Caleb looked at Emma, this woman who'd stumbled into his life like a miracle or a curse. He still wasn't sure which. Who'd cracked open his carefully constructed isolation, who'd given him a reason to care again, even though caring meant opening himself to loss. "When we get to Fort Bridger," Emma said, "when we face Thomas, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "That you'll be careful, that you won't do anything foolish because of what he did to Margaret, that you'll remember we're doing this for Daniel, not for revenge." Caleb wanted to make that promise, but 15 years of rage and grief made the words stick in his throat. Instead, he said, "I promise to keep you and your son safe, whatever it takes." It wasn't the promise she'd asked for, but it was the only one he could make. That night, they sat together by the fire long after they should have gone to sleep. Tomorrow, they would leave. Tomorrow, the journey would begin. But tonight, they had this: warmth and companionship, and the knowledge that neither of them would face what was coming alone. Emma fell asleep with her head on Caleb's shoulder, and he didn't move, didn't wake her. He just held her while the fire burned low and thought about second chances and the strange paths that led to redemption. They left at first light, the cabin locked behind them, supplies loaded on the mule Caleb had kept for trading trips he rarely made. The snow was still deep, but a crust had formed overnight, hard enough to walk on if you were careful, treacherous if you weren't. They moved slowly, Caleb breaking trail, Emma following in his footsteps. The journey would take 5 days if the weather held. 5 days through mountain passes and along frozen rivers, avoiding the main trails where they might be seen. Caleb knew these mountains better than anyone. He'd spent 15 years learning every ridge and valley, every shortcut and hiding place. It was the one advantage they had. On the second day, as they made camp in a sheltered hollow beneath a rock overhang, Caleb went through his pack one final time. He wanted to check the wanted poster to refresh his memory of Thomas Garrett's face. 15 years was a long time. Men changed, but some things, the eyes, the shape of a jaw, the way someone held themselves, those things stayed the same. He pulled out the oilcloth bundle where he kept his old papers. The wanted poster was on top, but beneath it was something he'd forgotten was there. Another poster, dated a year later, and another. He spread them out on a flat rock, and ice formed in his gut. Thomas Garrett, wanted for robbery, murder, arson. That was the poster he remembered. But these others, these showed the full scope of what Garrett had done. Not just one crime, but dozens. Towns terrorized up and down the territories, banks robbed, people killed. And there, in the third poster, a detail that made Caleb's blood run cold. Last, seen traveling with a young boy, approximately 6 years of age. Boy believed to be son of a previous victim. Garrett known to use children as leverage and cover. Emma came to look over his shoulder, carrying firewood. She saw the posters and went very still. "He's done this before," she whispered. Caleb spread out the posters, reading them more carefully now, seeing the pattern. Thomas Garrett wasn't just an outlaw. He was something worse, a man who specialized in destroying families, in taking children and using them as tools. After each robbery, each killing, witnesses reported seeing him with different children. Sometimes boys, sometimes girls. They'd disappear after a few months, and new children would appear. "What happened to them?" Emma asked, though her voice said she already knew the answer. "Nothing good." Caleb's hands were shaking. He'd known Garrett was ruthless, but this was evil on a scale he'd never fully understood. He'd use them as shields, as bait, make people think he was a family man, harmless. Then when the job was done, "Stop." Emma's voice cracked. "Just stop. I can't hear this." But there was more. Caleb found it in the last poster, dated 1868, a year after Margaret's death. The gang had been spotted in Montana Territory. Thomas Garrett and his brother, James Garrett. Both wanted, both dangerous. "James," Caleb said slowly, looking up at Emma. "Your husband. He wasn't just Thomas's brother. He was part of the gang." Emma shook her head, backing away. "No, James wasn't. He couldn't have." "Look at the poster, Emma. James Garrett, wanted in connection with multiple robberies and murders. The younger brother, 23 years old in 1868. That would make him the right age to be my husband." Emma sat down hard on a fallen log. "But he told me. He said he came from a respectable family back east, that he'd come west to make his fortune in timber. He never said anything about being an outlaw, about running with his brother's gang." Caleb gathered up the posters. Men like that don't advertise their past. They reinvent themselves. Thomas did it first, creating the Clark identity. James followed later, used the same last name, claimed to be Thomas's younger brother from back east. No one questioned it because no one knew to question it. Emma was crying now, quiet tears running down her face. "So everything was a lie. My whole marriage. The man I thought I knew. It was all a cover," Caleb finished. "Thomas sent his brother to marry into your family, to get close to your father's land holdings. When your parents died and you inherited, James stayed married to you to maintain the claim, and when he died, Thomas took over, took Daniel, took the land." Emma looked up at him, her face stricken. "And I played right into his hands. I had a child with a criminal. I brought Daniel into this world not knowing his father was—" "Oh God, Caleb, what have I done?" Caleb went to her, knelt in front of her, took her cold hands in his. You didn't know. You couldn't have known. James fooled you the same way Thomas fooled an entire town. These men are professionals at deception. But Daniel, my son, he's not just being held by a criminal uncle. He's being held by a man who's hurt children before, who's used them and... She couldn't finish the sentence. Which is why we're going to get him out. Caleb's voice was firm, certain. Thomas wants that boy for the land rights, nothing else. That means he'll keep Daniel safe until the legal claim is settled. He needs him alive and healthy to maintain the appearance of caring guardianship. You don't know that. Yes, I do. I spent 2 years studying how Thomas Garrett operates. He's ruthless, but he's smart. Everything he does is calculated. He won't hurt Daniel because hurting him serves no purpose. But he will use him, and we need to get there before... Before what? Before Thomas realized Emma was alive and moved the boy somewhere safer? Before the territorial court made its final ruling? Before Thomas decided a dead boy was worth more than a living one? Caleb didn't finish the thought out loud, but Emma heard it anyway. We need to hurry, she said, standing up. We need to get there now. We need to be smart. If we rush in, if we're not careful, Thomas will see us coming, and if he sees us coming, he'll run, or worse. Emma wiped her eyes, her jaw set. So what do we do? Caleb looked at the posters again, at Thomas Garrett's face staring back at him across 15 years. He'd failed to catch this man once, failed to bring him to justice, failed to protect Margaret and their baby. But he wasn't going to fail again, not this time, not when another child's life hung in the balance. We changed the plan, he said. Thomas thinks you're dead. We use that. Let him keep thinking it while we get close. We don't go to the lawyer first. We don't announce ourselves. We go straight for Daniel. A rescue operation. Exactly. We get in, get the boy, get out. Then, once he's safe, we bring the law down on Thomas's head with everything we've got. These posters, your testimony, mine. We end this. Emma nodded slowly. And if something goes wrong? Caleb strapped on his gun belt, checked his revolver, looked her in the eye. Then we make sure Daniel gets out no matter what. That's the only thing that matters. They broke camp in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The revelation about James changed everything Emma thought she knew about her marriage, her life, her choices. But it also clarified things. She wasn't fighting for custody against a respectable uncle. She was fighting to save her son from a monster who'd killed before and would kill again. As they walked through the snow, the mountains towering around them, Caleb thought about Margaret, about how she'd died because he hadn't seen the danger coming, hadn't protected her well enough. He'd spent 15 years punishing himself for that failure. But maybe, just maybe, he could find some kind of redemption in protecting Emma and her son, in stopping Thomas Garrett once and for all. The sun was setting when they made camp that night in a cave Caleb knew, deep enough to hide a fire from searching eyes. They sat close to the flames, eating dried meat and hardtack, not talking much. There was too much to say, and no way to say it. Finally, Emma spoke. If something happens to me, if Thomas finds out I'm alive and comes after us, you'll get Daniel out, won't you? You'll make sure he's safe. Nothing's going to happen to you. Promise me, Caleb. Please. Promise me that if you have to choose between saving me and saving Daniel, you'll choose my son. Caleb looked at her across the fire. This woman who'd somehow become more important to him than his own safety, his own peace. The woman who'd pulled him back into the world, who'd reminded him that some things were worth fighting for. I promise, he said, but I also promise I won't have to make that choice. We're both getting out of this alive, all three of us. Emma smiled, sad and grateful and afraid. I believe you. But Caleb wasn't sure he believed himself. They reached the outskirts of Fort Bridger on the 5th day, just as the sun was setting. Caleb had pushed them hard the last 2 days, covering ground faster than was comfortable, but slower than Emma would have liked. Every mile brought them closer to Daniel, but also closer to Thomas Garrett, a man who'd evaded justice for 15 years and wouldn't hesitate to kill again if his carefully constructed new life was threatened. Fort Bridger wasn't much to look at. A trading post that had grown into a small settlement, maybe 300 people if you counted the outlying ranchers and trappers who came in for supplies. But it was big enough to hide in, big enough for Thomas Clark to maintain his respectable facade while conducting whatever business kept him wealthy. Caleb led them to high ground overlooking the town, a ridge that gave a clear view of the main street and buildings below. They made camp in a thick stand of pine. No fire, eating cold rations while they watched the settlement through Caleb's old spyglass. "There," Emma said, pointing to a large house at the eastern edge of town. "That's Thomas's house. 2 stories, white paint, green shutters. I saw it once, before everything." Caleb focused the spyglass on the house. It was nicer than most buildings in town, set back from the street with a fence around the property. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys. Light glowed in several windows. As he watched, a woman came out the back door and dumped wash water, then hurried back inside against the cold. "The housekeeper," Emma said. "Mrs. Henshaw. She's older, a widow. Thomas hired her to care for Daniel, make things look proper." "Does she know what Thomas really is?" "I don't think so. She's just a woman who needs work, grateful for employment. Thomas is good at that, using people's needs against them." They watched for another hour as night fell completely. Lamps were lit in the house. Shadows moved behind curtains. Then, in an upstairs window, a smaller shadow appeared, a child's silhouette, standing still looking out at the darkening mountains. Emma made a sound, half gasp, half sob. "That's him. That's Daniel. I'd know him anywhere." Caleb handed her the spyglass. Through the lens, she could see more clearly. The boy stood at the window, one hand pressed against the glass. He looked thin, pale, but alive. Watching, waiting. "He knows I'm coming," Emma whispered. "Somehow he knows." They pulled back from the ridge before full dark, moving to their camp where they couldn't be seen from below. Caleb spread out his old journal, using the last of the daylight to sketch a rough map of the town and Thomas's property based on what they'd observed. "We need intelligence," he said. "Thomas's routines, how many men he has working for him, when the housekeeper leaves, everything. We can't just walk in blind." "How do we get that information?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he pulled out his badge, the tarnished star he'd carried for 15 years without wearing. "I have an idea, but you're not going to like it." The next morning, Caleb walked into Fort Bridger alone. He'd cleaned up as best he could, trimmed his beard, put on his cleanest shirt. The badge was pinned to his chest. He looked like what he was, or had been, a lawman from the territories, weathered but competent. He went straight to the town marshal's office, a small building next to the general store. The marshal was a man in his 50s, heavy-set with the look of someone who'd taken the job because it was easy, not because he cared about justice. "Help you?" the marshal asked, looking up from a newspaper. "Sheriff Stone, formerly of Blackwood, Montana Territory." Caleb showed his badge. "I'm tracking a fugitive. Thought you might be able to help." The marshal's interest picked up slightly. "What kind of fugitive?" Caleb pulled out the old wanted poster, the one showing Thomas Garrett. "This man. He's wanted in connection with multiple crimes from 15 years ago. I have reason to believe he's living in this area under an assumed name." The marshal looked at the poster, then back at Caleb. 15 years is a long time, Sheriff. Most bounties that old aren't worth pursuing. This one is. To me. Caleb met the marshal's eyes. He killed my fiancée, burned down a building with her inside. I've been looking for him ever since." Something in Caleb's voice must have convinced the marshal this was serious. He studied the poster more carefully. "You say he's using a different name?" "Yes. Probably respectable. Probably established. He's smart, this one. Knows how to blend in." The marshal was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then his expression changed. Recognition, followed quickly by discomfort. How old would this man be now? Mid to late 50s. And you say he's dangerous? Very. The marshal set down the poster like it might bite him. "Sheriff, I think you'd better talk to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. This is above my pay grade." "You know him, don't you?" Caleb said. "You know who he is." The marshal stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the street. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "There's a man in this town, respectable businessman, member of the town council. Lost his brother a couple years back, took in his nephew trying to do right by the boy. If you're suggesting that man is actually a wanted criminal from 15 years ago." "I'm not suggesting. I'm telling you. Thomas Clark is Thomas Garrett, and he needs to be arrested." "On what evidence? An old wanted poster and a grudge?" The marshal shook his head. "Clark's been here 5 years, built a successful trading business, helped fund the new schoolhouse, never caused a lick of trouble. If I arrest him based on what you've shown me, I'll be out of a job by sundown. He has a child, his nephew. The boy's not safe." "The boy's fine, I've seen him. Clark treats him well, provides for him. Hell, he's got a housekeeper to look after the kid proper. What more do you want?" Caleb felt his temper rising but forced it down. Getting angry wouldn't help. "I want you to do your job. I want you to investigate a credible lead on a wanted fugitive. And I want to keep my position and not stir up trouble where there isn't any." The marshal walked back to his desk. "I'll tell you what, Sheriff Stone. You get me more evidence, something concrete, something recent, and I'll look into it. But right now, all you've got is an old poster and a hunch. That's not enough." Caleb recognized a brick wall when he hit one. He took back the poster, tucked it in his coat. "Thank you for your time, Marshal." "Word of advice," the marshal called as Caleb reached the door. "Be careful who you accuse in this town. Thomas Clark has friends. Powerful friends. You go around making wild claims, you might find yourself in a cell instead of behind a badge." Caleb left the marshal's office and walked back into the cold morning air. So Thomas had corrupted the local law, or at least intimidated them enough that they wouldn't act. That changed things. They couldn't count on official help. They were on their own. He spent the rest of the day gathering information carefully. He visited the trading post, not Thomas's, but the competitor across the street. He talked to the shopkeeper, asked casual questions about businesses in town, about Thomas Clark's operation. The shopkeeper was happy to gossip, especially about a competitor. "Clark runs a tight operation," the man said. "Always has goods when others don't, always pays his suppliers on time. Keeps to himself mostly, except for town council meetings. Has a couple of men who work for him, rough types, but they keep the peace." "Rough types?" "Ex-soldiers, maybe, or hired guns. Hard to say. They don't cause trouble. Just hang around Clark's property, help with shipments. One of them's always at the house, though. Day and night. Makes you wonder what he's protecting." "What about the boy? His nephew?" The shopkeeper's expression softened. "Sad situation, that. Kid lost his parents. Clark took him in. Though I don't see the boy much. Clark keeps him close. Says it's for his safety. Some folks think it's a bit much, but who am I to judge how a man raises his kin?" Caleb bought some supplies he didn't need and left. The picture was becoming clearer. Thomas had guards, probably men who knew his real identity and were paid well to keep quiet. The boy was essentially a prisoner, though no one in town saw it that way. They saw a respectable man caring for his orphaned nephew. He met Emma after dark at a rendezvous point they'd agreed on, an abandoned trapper's cabin a mile from town. She'd stayed hidden all day, nearly mad with the need to do something, to act, to get her son back. The local law won't help, Caleb reported. Thomas has them convinced he's respectable or too afraid to act. Either way, we're on our own. Then what do we do? Caleb spread out his notes, everything he'd learned. Thomas has 2 guards, probably armed, watching the house in shifts. The housekeeper leaves every evening at 6, comes back at dawn to make breakfast. That gives us a window between 6 and midnight before the town settles down completely. Dark enough for cover, early enough that Thomas might not be fully alert. We go in tonight. Tomorrow night. I need to scout the property more carefully, find the best approach, identify weaknesses. He looked at her. And we need to prepare for what comes after. Once we take Daniel, Thomas will come for us. We'll need a head start, a place to hide until we can get to Cheyenne and the territorial marshal. Emma nodded, her face set with determination. I'm ready. Are you? Caleb asked quietly. Because once we do this, there's no going back. We'll be fugitives, technically. Kidnappers, in the eyes of the law, at least until we can prove Thomas is Garrett. We'll be running with a boy who hasn't seen his mother in months, who might not even recognize you, through winter country with armed men hunting us. You need to be sure. I've been sure since the day Thomas took my son. Emma met his eyes. I'll do whatever it takes. Break whatever laws I have to break. Risk whatever I have to risk. Daniel is my child, and I'm bringing him home. Caleb saw the steel in her, the same determination that had driven him for 2 years in his hunt for Garrett. The same willingness to sacrifice everything for what mattered most. All right then, he said. Tomorrow night, we get your son back, and then we disappear until we can make this right. They spent that night, planning every detail, every contingency. Caleb drew maps, explained timing, identified escape routes. Emma prepared supplies, organized their gear, made sure they could move fast once they had Daniel. Neither of them slept much. Both of them knew that tomorrow night would change everything, one way or another. Emma took the stairs as quietly as possible, her heart hammering so hard she thought everyone in the house must hear it. She knew which room was Daniel's. Second door on the right, facing the mountains. The door was closed. She pressed her ear against it, heard nothing, and slowly turned the knob. Daniel sat on the bed, the carved wooden horse in his hands. He looked up as the door opened, and his eyes went wide. For a terrible moment, Emma thought he might not recognize her. It had been months. Children changed quickly at his age, but then his face transformed, and she knew. "Mama," he whispered. Emma crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled him into her arms, pressing her hand over his mouth gently. "Quiet, sweetheart. We have to be very quiet. We're leaving, but we have to go now." Daniel nodded against her shoulder, trembling. She could feel how thin he'd gotten, could smell the soap Mrs. Henshaw used, could sense his fear and relief and confusion all mixed together. Her sons, her boy, finally. She pulled back, looked at his face. "Are you hurt? Has Thomas hurt you?" Daniel shook his head. "He's mean sometimes. Says bad things about you, but he doesn't hit me or anything." "Good. That's good." Emma grabbed his coat from a hook on the wall. "Put this on, quickly." Downstairs, she could hear voices. Thomas talking to someone at the front door. She had minutes at best. Daniel struggled into his coat, his hands shaking. Emma helped him with the buttons, then took his hand. "We're going out the back way. There's a man waiting for us, a friend. His name is Caleb. He's going to help us get somewhere safe." "The man who carved the horse?" "Yes. Now come on." They made it to the top of the stairs before they heard footsteps below. The second guard, the one who'd been patrolling outside, was coming in through the back door, the exact route Emma needed to use for escape. She pulled Daniel back, thinking fast. The front stairs were impossible. Thomas was there. The back was blocked. That left the window at the end of the hall, the one that looked out over the side yard. Emma led Daniel to the window and opened it as quietly as she could. Cold air rushed in. Below, about 12 feet down, was snow-covered ground. Not a terrible drop, but not good either. She looked at Daniel. "Can you do it? Jump down into the snow?" Daniel looked terrified but nodded. "If you're with me. I'll go first. Then you jump and I'll catch you. Can you be brave for me?" "I'll try." Emma climbed out onto the narrow ledge, hung by her hands, and dropped. She landed hard, the impact jarring through her legs, but the snow cushioned it. "Enough." She looked up at Daniel. "Your turn, baby. Jump. I've got you." Daniel climbed out, much clumsier than she had, his fear making him slow. Emma saw a lamp moving behind him. Someone coming down the hall, checking the rooms. "Now, Daniel, jump now." He jumped. Emma caught him, both of them going down into the snow. From inside, she heard a shout. They'd been discovered. Emma grabbed Daniel's hand and ran. Behind them, more shouting, the back door banging open, the guard yelling for Thomas. At the front of the house, Caleb heard the commotion and knew the plan had gone wrong. Thomas was still in the doorway, blocking his path, the guard beside him reaching for his gun. Caleb drew faster. The guard froze. "Tell your man to step back," Caleb said calmly. "I'm not here to buy supplies. I'm here for Thomas Garrett." Thomas's face went very still. Recognition dawned slowly, then shock. "You remember me?" "The sheriff from Blackwood, the one whose woman—" Thomas smiled, cold and cruel. "You never could let things go, could you? You killed her, burned her alive. I killed a lot of people. You'll have to be more specific." The guard was still frozen, caught between two armed men. Caleb could hear running footsteps from the back of the house. Emma and Daniel making their escape, he hoped. "It's over, Thomas. I know who you are. I know what you've done, and I'm taking you in." "On what authority? You're not a sheriff anymore. You're just a bitter old man with a grudge." "I'm a citizen making an arrest, and if you resist—" Caleb let the implication hang. Thomas laughed. "You think you can just walk in here and take me? I've built a life in this town. I have friends, power. You have nothing. I have the truth, and your nephew's mother, and enough evidence to hang you 3 times over." Thomas's expression changed. "Emma, she's alive. That's impossible. You killed the wrong woman in that river, or rather, you failed to kill her. She's taking her son back, and then she's going to testify against you for everything you've done." The second guard came running from the back, breathing hard. "Boss, the boy's gone. The woman took him out the window." Thomas's face went red with rage. He reached for a gun at his belt. Caleb's shot was faster, more precise. The bullet took Thomas in the shoulder, spinning him around, dropping him to the floor. "That's for Margaret," Caleb said quietly. The 2 guards raised their hands, suddenly aware they were on the losing side. Caleb kept his gun trained on them as he backed toward the door. "Your boss is wanted for murder and a dozen other crimes. If you're smart, you'll ride out tonight and not look back. If you're not, you'll hang alongside him." He reached the door, stepped out into the night, and ran. Behind him, Thomas was screaming orders, but no one was following. Not yet. Caleb found Emma and Daniel at the rendezvous point, both breathing hard, both crying. He didn't stop to talk. He just grabbed the pack of supplies they'd cached, handed Daniel to Emma, and led them up into the mountains. Behind them, Fort Bridger erupted in chaos. Lanterns, shouts, men searching, but the mountain man knew these hills better than anyone. And he was taking his new family somewhere safe. 3 months later, spring had fully arrived in the Wyoming mountains. The snow had melted except in the highest peaks, revealing green meadows and rushing streams. Wildflowers dotted the landscape in yellows and purples. The air smelled of pine and new growth and possibilities. Caleb's cabin had changed. The single room had been expanded with a lean-to addition that served as a bedroom for Daniel. Curtains hung in the windows. Real glass now, not oiled hide. A garden plot had been cleared and prepared for planting. The place looked lived in, loved, like a home instead of a hiding place. Inside, Emma stood at the stove making breakfast while Daniel sat at the table practicing his letters. The boy had grown in these 3 months. Not just physically, though he'd filled out on Emma's cooking and mountain air, but in confidence and happiness. He laughed now, asked endless questions about the animals and plants around them, followed Caleb like a shadow when they went to check the trap lines. Caleb came in from splitting wood, brushing sawdust from his shirt. He'd been building a new bookshelf. Daniel's appetite for reading was insatiable, and they'd need somewhere to put the books they'd ordered from Fort Bridger. Yes, from Fort Bridger. They weren't hiding anymore. The territorial marshal from Cheyenne had come personally, 2 weeks after the rescue. He'd listened to their story, examined the wanted posters, taken Thomas, still recovering from his gunshot wound, into custody. The trial had been quick once the full scope of Thomas Garrett's crimes came to light. The town marshal from Fort Bridger had been fired for corruption. Thomas's guards had turned state's evidence to save their own necks. Thomas Garrett had been hanged for murder 3 weeks ago. Caleb and Emma hadn't attended. They didn't need to see it. Justice was enough. The legal papers had come yesterday, delivered by a lawyer from Cheyenne, not Blackwood, who turned out to be another of Thomas's paid men, but a real lawyer working for the territorial court. Emma had full custody of Daniel. The land deed was in her name now, properly transferred. There was a document that made Caleb's throat tight when the lawyer read it aloud. Adoption papers, making Caleb officially Daniel's father if they chose to sign them. "We don't have to decide now," Emma had said, seeing his expression. But Caleb had taken the pen and signed without hesitation. This boy, this family, they'd saved him as much as he'd saved them. Now watching Emma cook and Daniel practice his letters, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in 15 years. Peace. Not the empty peace of isolation, but the full, complicated, wonderful peace of being part of something larger than yourself. On the shelf above the fireplace sat 3 objects: his old hunting knife with Margaret's initials carved in the handle, Emma's silver locket with Daniel's photograph inside, and Margaret's music box, which Daniel loved to wind and listen to before bed. The artifacts of their pasts, honored but not controlling their present. Caleb had told Daniel about Margaret last week, when the boy asked about the initials on the knife. He'd told him the whole story, the love, the loss, the years of running. Daniel had listened seriously, then hugged Caleb hard. "I'm sorry you lost them," Daniel had said, "but I'm glad you found us." The badge lay in the same shelf, polished now. Caleb wore it sometimes when he rode down to Fort Bridger for supplies. The territorial marshal had offered him a position as deputy for the region. He hadn't decided yet. But he liked the idea of using his skills for good again, of being part of the community instead of apart from it. Emma set plates on the table, eggs, bacon, fresh bread. They ate together, Daniel chattering about the fox he'd seen that morning, about the fishing trip Caleb had promised for later, about whether his mother thought they could get a dog. "Maybe," Emma said, smiling at Caleb over her son's head. "If your father thinks it's a good idea." Father. The word still made Caleb's chest tight. But it was a good tight, like coming home after a long journey. After breakfast, Daniel ran outside to play. Emma and Caleb stood at the window watching him, her hand in his. They'd been married for a month now, a quiet ceremony in Cheyenne with just the judge and a few witnesses. Emma wore a new ring on her left hand, one Caleb had bought with money from selling furs. She'd cried when he gave it to her, said it was the first time anyone had given her something that was just hers, freely offered with love. "He's happy," Emma said, watching Daniel chase after a grasshopper. "So are you." So are you. She looked up at him. Are you sure about this? About staying here, building this life? You worked so hard to get away from everything. I was running from grief, Caleb said. But you taught me the difference between running away and moving forward. I'm not running anymore. Emma leaned into him and he wrapped his arms around her. Through the window, they watched their son play in the mountain meadow, safe and loved and free. You know, Emma said, when I made that promise in your cabin that I would save you from loneliness, I had no idea how. And now? Now I think we saved each other. You pulled me from the river, but I pulled you back to life. Fair trade, I'd say. Caleb kissed the top of her head. Better than fair. That evening, as the sun set behind the peaks and painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, the three of them sat on the porch Caleb had built. Daniel was drowsy, leaning against Emma. Caleb held them both, his family, and felt the weight of the badge in his pocket. Not a burden this time, but a choice. Some men choose solitude because the world has taken too much from them, but some men learn that the hardest winters lead to the most beautiful springs. That family isn't just blood, but choice and commitment. That rescue can cut both ways, and sometimes the person you save ends up saving you right back. Caleb Stone had been that first kind of man for 15 years. But now, holding Emma and Daniel close while the mountains stood watch around them, he was something better. He was home.